There's no place that I'd rather be than on the open road with a map on my iPhone full of abandoned locations. There's nothing in this world that I'd rather be doing than urban exploring and being on that open road. Over the past 13 years, I've been able to explore and travel all across the country and see some of the best abandoned locations that America has to offer. However, to me, there is still no place like home, and home is Detroit. And in my opinion, Detroit is still, by far, the best city in America for urban exploring.
Decomposing bodies of 11 infants were found.
Any type of building that you can think of, any type of location that you can think of, Detroit had it, and it was abandoned. Highland Park Police Station, the evidence room, the knives used in stabbing, it was something to experience at that time.
87 of them vacant schools.
And still to this day, never seen anything like it. Hey, how you doing? I need 2 of them extra large French vanilla cappuccinos.
With shot espresso on each and the shot espresso on the side.
You know me too well. Hey, how y'all doing? My name is Bob. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and I am an urban explorer. I've been exploring for about 12, 13 years now. Started in 2008, it's 2020. Yeah, about that long. How I got started urban exploring is a little bit weird and a little bit strange, and without going into too much details. I was a heroin addict, and I've been clean now for about 15 years, but I was a heroin addict in Detroit back in about 2003, 2004, and I was hanging out with this OG, we call it. He was older than me, he was more experienced, and he took me to places to get high, shoot heroin, squat, those types of things. Well, he kept talking about this squat that he knew that we could go to. So we went into this abandoned building, literally, to go in there and shoot heroin and hang out. And when we were inside of this place, he began telling me about the history of this ballroom. Well, it looked like an abandoned, I don't know, it looked like a cave to me. It was horrible. It was dank, dirty, dark, wet. But he started telling me about, you know, the musicians that had played there. Janis Joplin and The Who and the MC5 and Ted Nugent. And I was a little skeptical, but I went with it. And then he said, let's go see the stage.
In its prime, it was the best place in the world to play. The best place in the world.
Whatever happened in Detroit in those days relative to rock and roll music was centered on the Grande Ballroom. Case closed.
So we went upstairs and there was the stage, and it was there, and with all of its architectural details and the dance floor and the chandeliers, and it was just incredible. And I didn't really think too much about it after that. I remember reading about it online, I think that day or the next day, that's how I found out it was the Grande Ballroom. And indeed, these musicians had played there.
From Dead,
Muddy Waters,
Jeff Beck,
Joe Cocker,
Paul Butterfield,
Cream, get out of here.
John Mayall,
James Cotton,
The Byrds,
Fleetwood Mac,
Johnny Hooker,
Rod Stewart,
Vanilla Fudge.
Led Zeppelin.
Musical pinnacles on a regular basis.
When the Who came to the Grande and they were acknowledged for what they really, really were, kept the band from just breaking up. If that Grande show had not happened, they would have just gone back to England and quit.
2008, I had been clean for a couple years. I was in Detroit for something, and I was on that side of Detroit for something. I was driving down Grand River. My mom had just given me a point and shoot camera. And this was not a fancy camera by any means, but it was a nice point and shoot. And I was messing around with it, and I drove by the Grande Ballroom, and it was like this feeling of I don't know, it was like reminded me of when I was in there with that OG. So I pulled over, stopped, went in, it was open. I went in, I took my point and shoot, and I actually photographed the stage, some of the architectural details, the dance floor, and it was amazing. Like, I felt the music. I could feel the energy that was still inside this place, even though it had been abandoned for 20-something years. And after leaving, I think I did a little more research, and then I started looking into other things around Detroit, abandoned things, and I came across this blog. And this blog was Detroit Funk. And he had an article at that time, or shortly after, that really got me into urban exploring. And that article was The Rape of Jane Cooper. And Jane Cooper was an elementary school on Detroit's east side that had been left open and left unsecured by Detroit public schools. So scrappers, thieves, vandals, the curious went in and started stealing things and scrapping and vandalizing and damaging. And so he had done this article, The Rape of Jane Cooper, about how these people had really torn apart this once beautiful school. At that time, he had done a few more schools after that, like there was Joy Middle School and Brewer. So I actually went to those locations. I went to Jane Cooper, I went to Joy Middle School, I went to Brewer, and I started with the point and shoot. I started to photograph these locations. And that was my first real urban exploration. Although at the time I didn't really know I was urban exploring or what that was, but that was definitely my first days and first times of urban exploring.
I think there's a guard, but he's not here.
He's like on watch or just...
Maybe, I don't know.
So I started exploring a little bit of a few of these schools and started exploring a little more and more. There wasn't very many people doing it at that time, especially in Detroit, really all over the country, but there was a handful of people. I was really basically a loner with my girlfriend at that time. And I feel like there was this one group. They were the survival crackers, and Red Wagner, he was the man. He was really the leader. And I looked up to him. I looked up to all the crackers, but the survival crackers were doing this before me, and they were really inspirational and motivating to me. So I would run into them occasionally, and these guys kind of showed me the ropes a little bit, and they taught me some do's and don'ts, and taught me about urban exploring and the term urban exploring, what you should do and what you shouldn't do and things like that. And Red Wagner, Dave Paris, John Amish, some of those video clips are just absolutely, they're crazy, they're wild, they're nuts. And you'll see some of their video clips on the documentary that you should be watching. Some of the footage that you see is from the survival crackers. So big shout out to those guys. They really influenced me and brought me in under their wing and kind of showed me the ropes and the way of urban exploring. They had one location at Detroit House of Corrections. These guys, like I said, their videos and their stories are wild. One of the survival crackers went into it was a prison, abandoned prison, Detroit House of Corrections, went into the jail cell, and the door shut behind him somehow, and he got locked in the cell. And there was no way they could get him out of the cell.
Reach in there, but I mean,
talk about anxiety, panic. So literally the only thing they could do was call the police and say, we're in this abandoned prison and our friend is locked in a jail cell and we cannot get him out. They got in deep trouble for that, by the way. Great story, though.
Good enough, it's good enough.
That'll work, Johnny.
He means Steve. My name is Steve.
Oh, right.
when I was exploring all these abandoned buildings, I really started going hard after about the first year or two. And Detroit at that time, like I said, didn't have a lot of explorers, urban explorers, but what they did have was a lot of abandoned buildings. And actually Detroit was considered the Mecca at one time because of the amount of abandoned buildings that we had. Detroit had so many abandoned buildings. In fact, Detroit had any type of building that you can think of, any type of location that you can think of, Detroit had it, and it was abandoned. Whether it was downtown skyscrapers, we had a graveyard of skyscrapers downtown Detroit. There was an article in the Free Press in 2004 that was called The Dirty Dozen, and there was like the towers of neglect, 12 abandoned skyscrapers. No other city had that like Detroit did. And we had bowling alleys, funeral homes, strip clubs, churches, banks, grocery stores, theaters, arenas, stadiums, anything, a zoo, anything you can name, we had it, and it was abandoned. And it was something to experience at that time. And still to this day, I've never seen anything like it. So some of those locations, you will definitely see some of that throughout this documentary. And Detroit has really changed a lot over the last few years. Detroit definitely is not the Mecca anymore for abandoned buildings, although we obviously still have our share. It's definitely not the Mecca. The downtown area, every single one of those dirty dozen towers of neglect, skyscrapers, have all been renovated and restored. Maybe one or a couple were demolished. But they restored most of them. Detroit has really got out of bankruptcy. They were able to recoup losses and really reestablish the big three in the auto industry. So a lot of things, population started coming back into the city and started getting funding, and a lot of these places that I mentioned, the churches, the schools, the theaters, the bowling alleys, the police stations, they ended up getting renovated or repurposed or restored. Unfortunately, some got demolished in that process, but I prefer renovating and restoring because we're still able to hold on to the history that way and the culture, and they try to save some of the architectural details. And a lot of times they even restore the former buildings restore the buildings to their former glory. And that's always incredible too, as long as I've explored it before they start doing that. All right, so some of these locations that I want to mention also are the schools in Detroit. Detroit had over 100 abandoned schools in the city alone. I think the next city was Chicago with like 50. So just imagine that. Every neighborhood in the city of Detroit had a school and it was abandoned. And that is no joke. Literally today, I think there's still like 70 or 80. They've obviously demolished some and renovated some, restored some.
A new push to sell abandoned schools sitting vacant for years and vulnerable to thieves.
It's too expensive for the Detroit School District to secure them, so the goal is to unload them. Ronnie Dahl is on Detroit's northwest side. And Ronnie, what can you tell us?
Well, some of these I think are going to be pretty hard for them to sell, like Crossman Alternative High School. We've told you about the terrible condition of this school before. Scrappers have taken just about anything and everything valuable out of this building. Maybe its greatest asset, though, is its location. It's not far off the Lodge Freeway, and there are plenty of other school buildings just like this one up for grabs. When the Detroit Public School District ran into financial trouble, schools were closed. Year after year, they sat, decaying, bringing down neighborhoods. Nearby residents pleaded for something to be done. That day could be today.
The school district is not in the business of holding on to real estate. We educate children.
At a redevelopment conference, the school district is trying to offload 120 properties, 87 of them vacant schools, in all different conditions. The district realizes the schools used to be the fabric of a community. Sitting vacant is adding to a neighborhood's decline and taking valuable resources from educating kids. They believe developers will be able to look beyond the destruction and see opportunity.
Every dollar that we spend, whether it's patrolling a building at night or securing a board that comes out, or even running the electricity that keeps where there are alarms and video cameras, as there are at a number of our vacant properties, all of that takes resources that could be better used.
Some of the stories from these schools are some of my crazier stories and some of the crazier things that I've ever experienced. When I first started exploring, there was not the security measures that are really involved in these places that there are today. And a few years ago, maybe 2010, 2011, the schools were one of the first places to get security measures put in by Detroit Public Schools, probably because of the article about the rape of Jane Cooper, maybe. So they actually started to put metal sheets over the windows and doors called VPS. Then there was also little motion sensor cameras inside of the schools. And when somebody would enter a school, it would trip the motion sensor and record. And then this little video clip would be sent to the police. And no, we're not talking about Detroit police, because Detroit police don't give a shit. They're gonna be like, whatever. But Detroit Public Schools police, whole different story. These police officers, legit police officers, probably felt like they weren't respected like regular police officers, so they really had to be tough and they had to be hard asses. And it took me a few times of getting my head knocked before I finally caught on. I got arrested, I think it was 7 or 8 different times by Detroit Public Schools police alone. As a matter of fact, to this day, 12 years, 13 years in, I've never even had an encounter with Detroit police, but I've had about a dozen with Detroit Public Schools police. So I'd go in and I'd set off this, and of course I didn't know there was a motion sensor or a camera at that time, so I thought I'd be good. And I kept getting, cops kept coming to these locations and busting me, and finally I said, how the hell do you guys know I'm in here? And that's when they told me. So I still didn't learn. I actually would be going in and giving myself 5 minutes, and I would run and gun, run around taking photos as fast as you can, hit certain sections of the school one day and come back next week and hit the other section. So I'd do it kind of strategically, just to get the photos. Well, one day in particular, I really learned my lesson. No, I didn't, but I thought I did at the time. I got arrested at Grant Elementary School. Grant Elementary School is just a small elementary school on the east side of Detroit. They had the videofied cameras. That's what that system was called, the motion sensor cameras. And I knew they were in there. I was pretty sure they were in there. And we gave ourselves 5 minutes. We ran in, we shot it, we ran out. And as soon as we walked around that corner, Detroit Public Schools police were waiting for us. And they were not happy, of course. They immediately arrested us, put us in handcuffs, took us to jail, and we spent 2 nights in jail. So 3 days in jail over an abandoned school that was wide open, that we didn't even break into, but they charged us. They were trying to charge us with what they said, breaking and entering. So 3 days later, they come by, get us, and they just release us with no charge. So we get released, but my car didn't get towed, but it got driven to the Detroit Police, Public Schools Police headquarters. So I go to get my car, and they're like, oh no, you have to talk to the chief of Detroit Public Schools Police. And I'm going, why do I gotta talk to the chief? And the chief wasn't even there that day. So I had to come back on another day. And this was a few years back, so it's a little vague, but I remember This chief literally sat me down and told me, Bob, of course he didn't call me Bob, he probably had another choice name for me, but when are you gonna learn? He pulled up my rap sheet. He said, you've been arrested or stopped by our police officers 7 times in the past year alone. When are you gonna learn your lesson? You're lucky you're still not in jail. I pled my case. I told him I was sorry. Told him I wouldn't go into another school. And I didn't go into another school for about a week. So of these over 100 abandoned schools, one of my favorite locations, and not even just of the schools, locations in general, one of my favorite locations of all time was Cass Technical High School. Cass Tech, pre-Depression era, 8-story school, built in the Cass corridor. Beautiful, beautiful school. Famous people went to Cass Tech, John DeLorean, the gangster Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, Lily Tomlin, lots of different famous people. So when it had three gymnasiums, 2 swimming pools, and 2 auditoriums. This place was huge, 8 stories, literally everything left. The library had the books, the science lab had all the beakers and chemicals. An incredible location. One of the crazier stories was when I first explored Cass Tech. This would have been 2009 probably. I was with my girlfriend, like I said at the time. We went in and we explored Cass Tech for a few hours. We thought everything was cool. Back then, there was a piece of a door with a little window slit, and somebody had broken the little window, so you could reach in and pop the door. Well, somebody had put a board over this after they had busted the glass, so you could kind of lift the board and reach in and pop it. So when I was leaving, I decided to peek out and see, okay, if there's anybody out there, is there any police or whatever. And when I looked out, I saw a glimpse of what I thought was like a guy standing right to the right of me, outside though. So I shut the door really quick and sat there, and I told my girlfriend, there's a guy right there. So I was like, what I'll do is I'll take that little window slit and I'll push the board over and I'll peek out there. That way I don't have to open the door and he won't hear it or whatever. So I pushed the little board over, and when I went to peek out, that man was literally staring into the window. So when I pushed it over, there was eyes right there. And this guy something was up with this guy. He had a cape on, he was naked, and he had a cape on. So it literally baffled me. I shut the window thing and I said, we got to try to get another way out. We knew there was no other way out. So we just waited, and then when we finally got back to the door, we decided that we would just run. So we opened the door and we ran, and when we ran, he chased us all the way home. I didn't live that far. I lived in the Cass corridor at that time, so I wasn't that far. But he literally chased us, and then that's when I noticed he was naked, he did have a cape, and he had a sword in his hand. He was yelling superhero stuff. Odd, but a crazy story at that. So Cass Tech was one of the bigger schools in Detroit that was abandoned, and one of the high schools. But there was McKinsey, Redford, Cass Tech, Kettering, Southwestern, Finney, Cooley. I mean, there was 8, 9 abandoned high schools throughout that time. And Cass Tech was definitely my favorite, but all the high schools were incredible because of the sheer size of the schools. Being that they're high schools, they were large. A lot of the high schools had all the amenities, pools and gyms and auditoriums, and some of the auditoriums were just built, just magnificent architecture and details that was just mind-blowing, and why they would leave these places abandoned and things like that. Many of them are demolished now, and a couple have been renovated and repurposed, but most of them are actually demolished now, including Cass Tech, which was demolished in 2010. And besides Cass Tech, I think the other high school worth mentioning was Cooley High, simply because of how beautiful and huge this place was. Mediterranean revival, twin cupolas on each side, incredible ornate details on the exterior and interior, and the auditorium. It's just mind-blowing. Unfortunately, arson fire destroyed that auditorium a few years ago. When the seats caught on fire, it literally burnt all the seats, it burnt almost all the details. You could still see some of the details, but it definitely ruined that school once and for all. And cops, the Detroit Public Schools police, because they still own it, they will arrest you. They will go in and they will arrest you if they know you're in there. So be careful if you go, or just stay out. So over the last 12 years or so, I've had the privilege and honor to explore some of Detroit's best locations. Really, some of the best locations in the country, but definitely in Detroit. Some of those were the skyscrapers. We talked about it earlier. In Detroit, we had this graveyard of skyscrapers. And I felt this energy when I would go downtown with these massive structures all around you at all different angles. Everywhere you look, there's an abandoned skyscraper. And to be in that was like something you can't even explain it, because literally there's no other city that was like that. So you never really got to experience that anywhere outside of Detroit. One of those in particular that's worth mentioning was the Book Tower, which was 40 stories tall. And at the time, it was the tallest abandoned building in the US. Climbing those stairs in the summertime was a nightmare. Before you were halfway up, you were ready to go home. But what made it and what pushed you was the view from the 40 stories of the city, of the other skyscrapers. Just incredible view that was unmatched, really. Not to mention there was a radio station in there. There was a sewing business. There was a recording studio, a museum, a hair salon, and the lobby was extraordinary. The lobby was golden, and they had these brass angels that were holding up a brass clock, and it kind of looked like the clock was floating and the angels were holding it up, and it was incredible to see that stuff. And it was by far one of the best skyscrapers that Detroit had. Another one that was just down from that, not too far, was the Broderick Tower, originally named Eaton Tower. But David Broderick had bought it at some time. That was built, I want to say it was built around 1920. And when David Broderick bought it, he renamed it the David Broderick Tower. Well, hell, if I bought a building, I would name it after me too. So I understood that. But this building was incredible because you had, actually, unlike the Book Tower where you had a lot of different things, this building was really only dental offices and orthodontics. And they had laboratories with the moldings of the teeth and the dental chairs and the dental equipment and the x-rays, and everything was still inside the Broderick Tower, making it one of the great buildings to explore. Not to mention the roof, it was 20-something stories, and you could watch Detroit Tigers baseball games from the Comerica Park, which was right across the street. So you could literally go up there and watch Tigers games, and it was nothing like it. Beautiful place. So another building worth mentioning would be the United Artists Building and United Artists Theater. They were separate locations in the same building, basically. United Artists Building was maybe 15 stories and had an old rusty bank vault in the basement, which was really cool to explore and photograph. The United Artists Theater was one of the most incredible and beautiful locations and theaters in the country. This place was phenomenal. It literally was this Gothic structure that looked like it was melting because of all the decay from being abandoned for all these years. And there was no other theater or even location that was built like this in this Gothic sense. Absolutely breathtaking when you would see it. And literally back in those days, you could climb through a window and go in, or through a door. Now, New Detroit versus Old Detroit. Now, you can't even touch that building without the alarms going off and Ehrlich's goons showing up in about 2.5 seconds, if not Detroit's finest. That's the difference between then and now. Now, you can't even do that building anymore. One of Detroit's most famous, or more famous, abandoned buildings, Michigan Central Station, aka the train station. Most people know about the train station because it was so symbolic of Detroit's ruins, or downturn, or even the bankruptcy, because you literally had this huge abandoned building that was a train station on the outskirts of downtown that was such an, I guess it was kind of, people thought it was an eyesore. I never thought it was an eyesore. I always thought it was beautiful. I mean, it was built in 1912, rose at like 20 stories. Same architects as the Grand Central Terminal, New York City. This thing was a classic, right? And it sat abandoned for many, many years. There wasn't anything in it, but it was just the grandiose, the lobby, the coffered ceilings, the arches, the details, the columns, the marble, the granite. All of that stuff was actually still in there. You literally could feel this energy of passengers and people coming off the train in the concourse and sitting in the lobby or the ticket window. I mean, all of that stuff was still there, and you could clearly see where it was. It was just super cool. I think about a year or two ago, Ford Motor Company bought the Michigan Central Station, and they are currently renovating it and going to turn it into their headquarters, I believe, with some retail shopping. And so there's some plans for it.
This will be mostly used for commercial space, little pop-up stores, some community meeting areas, and things like that. So we're still in the midst of programming a lot of that, but we know that this really is going to be community space. It's really important that this building was important to the community and that we're giving it back to the community. So it'll always be open during our normal business hours, and we'll be able to bring in everybody from the community to enjoy the space.
Had we been looking at this 10 years ago, you would have had a lot of empty buildings there.
You know, whenever they show a picture of how bad Detroit is, this is the place.
Yes, this was the poster child. That used to always drive me. Somebody who's lived here my whole life, I hated that kind of publicity for our city and for this structure.
What are you thinking?
Now, Ford Motor Company Executive Chairman Bill Ford Jr. is doing something about that. His company just bought this 500,000 square foot behemoth and is turning it into Ford's new hub for autonomous and electric vehicle research.
When we started thinking about the future of transportation and autonomous driving, it's very clear that that will happen first in cities. And therefore, we have to get experience on city streets. And cityscapes is where that will all be invented.
The 2,500 Ford employees who are expected to work here will do more than transform a building. They will also help revive an entire neighborhood, Corktown, one of the oldest parts of the city.
And then one of the other really cool things is the graffiti. There's some really cool stuff that we're going to look at trying to figure out how to keep and really tell the story, not only of its total restoration, but the graffiti is a big part of the building. It's a big part of Detroit and how things have evolved. Artists learn their crafts in this building. So we'll have an area in the building which we're trying to figure out where the best place to have it, but to really talk about the history and its decay, its growth and decay.
So there's some plans for it. Again, the old Detroit versus the new Detroit. Don't even think about stepping foot in Michigan Central Station. They got that place alarmed, cameras, security out front 24/7. Back in the day, no problem. Hop a fence and then go right in the door. Yet another one worth mentioning. Mark Twain Public Library. Mark Twain Public Library was a historical building, and it was a beautiful building. But what made Mark Twain Library so special? All the books were left behind, rotting away in this library. And you don't really see books like that left behind in an abandoned location. It literally looked like they had locked the doors and left everything as it was. They still had the sections and the paperbacks and the novels and everything. Absolutely incredible to see that. I always called it pretty iconic because you literally had a waste of knowledge going on with Mark Twain Library. It was demolished in 2011. Talked earlier a little bit about Detroit having over 100 abandoned schools. Well, we also had about almost a dozen, abandoned police stations. Now that's something you don't hear every day. Back in 2010 or so, there was definitely the majority of them. A few of them were later abandoned throughout the years. But we had 3rd Precinct, 6th Precinct, 7th Precinct, 8th Precinct, 12th Precinct, 13th Precinct, Belle Isle Police, Highland Park Police Station, and infamous 1300 Beaubien, the Detroit Police Headquarters downtown. All of those police stations were abandoned, and luckily for me, I was able to explore and photograph every single one of them. One of them that really stands out, Highland Park Police Station. Highland Park Police Station was absolutely incredible and disturbing at times because of what was left inside. And you had the fire station and the courthouse also right across the street. So you had a police station, a fire station, and a courthouse right in the same city block. But Highland Park Police Station, I've never seen anything like it and probably never will, simply because of everything that was left. And it was historic, which is always a bonus. The jail cells were all old and historic and really decayed and paint peeling. And they had isolation cells, and they had just regular cells, and then they had the benches. And then you had, let's not forget, the evidence room. The evidence room, there was so much evidence left behind and abandoned in the evidence room, from rape kits to knives used in stabbings to drugs. I found marijuana and cocaine, none of it good anymore, of course. I found criminals' files. I found old mugshots and fingerprint index cards, ammunition and guns, a bloody glove found on a dead guy, stolen car radios from like the 80s and 90s, and stolen license plates, and just incredible, stolen bikes. Then you had the homicide division. And let me tell you, those crime scene photos, they still disturb me to this day. I still have nightmares from looking at those crime scene photos. They were so graphic. Homicide division was really cool too, because you had like killers, mugshots on the wall. You had like old files of murders and things like that that you could literally read through and look at. And then they had all of Ben Atkins, who was the Woodward Corridor serial killer back in 1990-91. They had his comparison victim posters down there still that had his, I think he had killed over a handful of women. They had all their names and how they were found and what they were nude or gagged and bound and drugged, and just absolutely incredible that all of that stuff was still inside Highland Park Police Station. Just a few years ago, I actually watched this show on the ID channel, which is a true crime channel, about this rape and murder of this woman. She's now a woman. Her mother, when she was young, was raped and killed in Highland Park. And they visit the Highland Park Police Station, which was demolished in 2011. So they actually had footage of the Highland Park Police Station, and she said the reason why the guy had gotten away with it for so long was because the evidence was left inside. Probably the rape kit was left inside the abandoned police station in Highland Park, and then eventually destroyed when it was demolished. Detroit actually has 4 boxing rings. A lot of people don't know. There was 3, and then a 4th one was discovered later. It's funny because I remember seeing like social media, other explorers, as urban exploring has become popular over the years. Saw it on social media. People were going to abandoned boxing ring in New Haven, Connecticut, and Philadelphia. And I would remember seeing those boxing rings, which were cool. But I would say to myself, little do they know, Detroit has 3 or 4. So yeah, you had King Solomon Church. There was a boxing ring in the basement that was still set up with the ropes, and then a heavy bag in the corner, which was really cool. In the basement of a church too, which is odd. Still cool though. Then you had Veterans Memorial Rec Center in River Rouge, right on the border of River Rouge and Detroit, which was really cool because it had the ring still set up with heavy bags, speed bags, all sorts of pull-up bars, and all sorts of different things used to train basically for boxers. And then you had the Yamasaki Building, which is over there, Northland area. And that was really, really amazing because you had a skylight that was just let in all natural light right down onto the boxing ring. That was the one that was discovered later. And then the 4th one being the most notorious, which was Crunk Gym. Crunk Gym was absolutely classic and historic. I mean, it literally was historic, but it was also historic because of the history of Emanuel Stewart and him training the fighters out of there. Hilmer Kinsey and Jermaine Taylor and Tommy Hitman Hearns. They all fought out of Crunk, and he trained over 40 championship fighters from Detroit at Crunk Gym in this little dark, wet basement.
Emanuel Stewart, a well-known American boxer, trainer, and commentator for HBO Boxing, trained 41 world champion fighters throughout his career, right here at Crunk Gym.
To see that and knowing that all these fighters had trained out of there and Emanuel Stewart trained these guys there, super cool. There was also a pool and an auditorium and stuff inside, and a gym inside Crunk, but nothing beat that boxing ring. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by arson fire in 2016. Mid-rise that's definitely worth talking about would be the historic Farwell Building, which was another pre-Depression era building built in, I believe it was Capitol Park, Capitol Park in Detroit, and was recently renovated and reopened. And so they did restore this, and they restored it to its former glory, including the octagon shaped skylight that went through all 8 or 9 stories of the building. And it was really, it's famous. You see a lot of people photograph it. And even now that it's reopened, you see people photograph it and post it. It's such a cool octagon skylight. And you don't see stuff like that that goes all the way up throughout the entire building, from the ground to the roof with this skylight. Incredible stuff. Iron railings and details. There was Tiffany glass mixed in the mosaic tiles in the ceiling of the lobby, the arched ceilings. Unmatched. Absolutely beautiful building. Another location or two worth mentioning are the funeral homes in Detroit. There's a few of them, and they're quite crazy, and this one in particular has a great story. That would be the infamous and notorious Cantrell funeral home. The state of Michigan license and regulations went in and closed down the funeral home in 2018 because of deplorable and horrific conditions. Literally, they were not properly storing bodies or bodily fluids, and cremated remains and all sorts of different things. They were having all sorts of trouble, so they shut them down. So I was able to explore it and photograph it, and they had left caskets and urns and there's all sorts of embalming tables and gurneys, including somebody's fake prosthetic leg. But you know, it was crazy because there was also baby caskets in this place. Didn't think anything of it. Explored it a few times, went on my way. Somebody bought Cantrell Funeral Home, and when they were renovating it to turn it into a community center, the workers found mummified infant babies in the ceiling.
Yeah. The current owner of the building, Nived Syed, showed me where the decomposing bodies of 11 infants were found. Up these steps, behind all of this insulation.
Right there.
So yes, that was in there when I actually explored it and had no idea. But I do remember where the attic was and the drop ceiling was, and I remember there was a foul odor coming from that area, but I just assumed it was the funeral home. You know, I didn't know at the time, of course, and I didn't want to go up into the drop ceiling. Why would I do that? Now, I wish I would have. When I first started exploring, there was a funeral home on the west side called Howell. Howell Funeral Home had been closed for, at least 20 years or so. And it was actually somebody's house converted to a funeral home. And it was a pretty plain explore, wasn't really much to it. But when we went down in the basement, we found about a dozen cremated remains with death certificates and the ashes still in there and everything.
Albert Blue was cremated in 2005 at the Howell Funeral Home, formerly known as the Ramsey Funeral Home. Her mother was paying for the cremation.
She was going through some financial difficulty.
Before her mother could even finish paying,
And the funeral home just closed down, and we didn't have any closure with that.
now several years later, her mother has passed, and Revel is finding out 35 cremains were recovered at the shuttered funeral home.
That was the first time I had ever found actual cremated remains, because this was probably 2010, 2011. And it was quite disturbing. We photographed it, and then we ended up leaving them. I went back 10 years later, and they were still in that basement. So I decided to do the right thing and call the authorities and get them returned back to their families, which indeed did happen.
It's important that people then reach out to the state investigation department, that is Laura. If they call Laura, they can check in with them to see if they can find out any information about whether or not their loved ones are a part of the cremated remains.
Actually, recently, there was another funeral home that found around Detroit. And a dozen cremated remains. This funeral home that we just did, over 100 cremated remains left behind. So the last and final locations I want to talk about are the stadiums and arenas that Detroit had. Detroit was rare and unlike any other major US city or any city really in the world, because we had all 4 major sports we had stadiums and arenas that were abandoned. You had Tiger Stadium, where the Detroit Tigers played baseball. You had the Pontiac Silverdome, where the Detroit Lions used to play football. You had Joe Louis Arena, where the Detroit Red Wings used to play hockey. And then you had the Palace Auburn Hills, where the Detroit Pistons used to play basketball. So you had all four major league sports. And all of them were abandoned. And luckily for me, I was able to explore and photograph all four of them. My first one that I did was Tiger Stadium in 2009. It was demolished in 2010, but they started demolishing in 2009. And so that's when I made my move to go in. Went in through a hole in the fence and was able to photograph the seats and the stands and the press box and the flagpole. The Tiger Stadium had an actual flagpole in center field that was in fair territory. It's the only stadium that had that. And it's still there. But when we were photographing the stands, we heard somebody yell. And right away, I knew that it was security. And it was my girlfriend and I at the time. We waited for a minute to see if it really was, and it was. And he started running not running, but walking fast and yelling, "Hey, hey." So we booked it out the fence the same way we came in, and we waited. We kind of sat across the street, and he came after us. He came out of the fence, started coming across the street, so we ran around the building. And then when we came back around the building, he had gotten to his car, and he was driving around looking for us. I mean, it was pretty weird, especially because it was wide open, but we got away and didn't get in trouble, and that was the most important thing. So the next one that would have been the Pontiac Silverdome, which was where the NFL football Detroit Lions used to play. And this was very iconic because it was a dome, and it had big, huge white dome in a bowl setting, with the football field down below. And when I explored that in 2013, 2014, it had not been closed for very long, maybe a year or two. And we didn't know anything about it when we had went. We didn't know anybody that had done it. We didn't know anybody that explored it. And it was me and my boy Dave Paris at that time. We actually went there expecting to see security, and there was nobody around. So we literally looked at each other and we're like, well, let's just go for it. So we hopped over the fence, and we found this door that was open, and we went in, and I remember walking through down the corridor and then out into the field, and it opened up to all these seats. At that time, about half the dome was still there. So they still had the dome up, and then some of the pieces of the dome were on the field. But just to explore an NFL stadium like that and be in that environment really did something for me, and really was mesmerizing being in that location and seeing it like that. And the Pontiac Silverdome was also a great experience for me because I also grew up going to NFL games to watch the Detroit Lions at the Silverdome as a kid. And when I went in there, I don't want to say I was the first, but I definitely was one of the first. When I went in there and I felt that energy, and I could literally visualize Barry Sanders running down the field.
You think you got him tackled? I mean, that's by keeping your feet going and making Sanders move. Some of those moves, there's only one guy in this game that makes, and you just saw that guy.
A lot of people, a lot of explorers and non-explorers alike, a lot of people just came to Detroit to go to the Silverdome. People would literally come from all over to go to the Silverdome so they could experience an abandoned major sports stadium like this. A lot of them had never explored an abandoned stadium or arena or sporting venue or anything like that. So this was a first for a lot of people. And it was pretty relaxed and chill for those few years until they finally started catching on and ticketing people. They put security back on site. Security would see, I don't know, dozens of people going in there. They started calling the police. Police would come in, ticket people, arrest them. It's like a $500 ticket for getting caught trespassing in the Silverdome. But it still didn't slow people down from going. They still went right up until they demolished it about a year or two ago. And then we had Joe Louis Arena, which was where the Detroit Red Wings played hockey. Joe Louis Arena was a little bit of a challenge in the beginning to explore because of how guarded. They had security on each side and security inside. And they had it pretty locked down for a long time. One time I got a door open and I started walking in and I heard something, so I left the door ajar, and I came back an hour later and the door was shut and locked. So I knew that people definitely were keeping a close eye on it. I eventually got in to Joe Louis, and when I did, it was another one that took me back to childhood, as going to Joe Louis Arena as a kid and watching the Red Wings and Steve Yzerman. The energy in there was like you could feel the fans, and you could almost see the octopus being thrown on the ice, and won several Stanley Cups, at least 3, I believe, in Joe Louis Arena. So just the iconic location for Detroit. Joe Louis Arena was demolished this year. Last would have been the Palace of Auburn Hills, which is where the Detroit Pistons play basketball. The Palace was a little bit interesting because we dressed up like construction workers to try to get in there, and it worked for the most part. Dressing up like a construction worker to try to blend in, because the only time that you could really go in there without being spotted by security was when they were actually working on the building. So we came up with the idea to dress up like construction workers and actually go in to the Palace of Auburn Hills while they were working on it and photograph and explore it. And we were able to do that without getting into trouble. I swear the only reason is why, because we had the helmet and the vest, and it worked like a charm. The Pistons won a championship at the Palace in 2004. I believe the Shock did too, and the back-to-back Bad Boys won their championships in '89 and '90. So a few championships won at the Palace. Unfortunately, it was demolished this year as well. Where would I be if it wasn't for urban exploring? Honestly, I have no idea. It's not only become a hobby of mine, but it's become a way of life. For me, I don't just love this, I live this. I feel like urban exploring has taken me all over the country, and hopefully soon all over the world, and to be able to travel and experience different places, different cultures, and different ethnicities, and different cities, and different regions. It's really opened my mind to ways of life and what I want to do with my life and how I want to live my life. And I know that I may not be here tomorrow, so I'm going to explore while I'm still alive, because this is what I do, and this is my passion, and this is my life.